Hi everyone, thanks for coming to Tea and Tales. This is the 6th Tea and Tales of the season, and our theme this year is the 100th anniversary of the railway. It was 100 years ago that the train finally came to Pemberton, and it was a critical event for Pemberton. Settlement would not have been possible without the arrival of the train. There were many surveys through the area, because when the railway was proposed, there were many railways proposed in British Columbia through that time period. And some of those early surveys spurred development all the way up the meadows, to the point where even a platform for a train station was built up the meadows. That's how sure people were the train was going to go there. This isn't what happened. The rail actually followed the Gold Rush route pretty much from Pemberton. It followed the route down to Darcy and along the lakes to Lillooet. Eric Andersen is here with us today because he's a local historian out of Squamish. He's collaborated with us on several things, including our 2012 100 Years of Forestry celebration. And he was keen to look into this early railway survey period and what the heck was going on. Why did everybody think that you could get north, through the meadows, and who were these people, and how many different railway charters were there? So this is what Eric's going to talk to us about today. He's also here this evening. We're going to be presenting this again in the evening at 7 p.m. at the library. He'll be presenting a different topic. It'll be Emily Carr's 1933 Journey by Rail. So we encourage you to come to that one too, if you're available, because Eric's only with us for the day, and then he's back to Squamish. He, though he wasn't born in Squamish, he is a native of Squamish. He was born in Alberta, but very soon they moved to Squamish. He went to school there and is currently involved in the building of a museum with the Sea to Sky Forestry Society. So we're very pleased that he had any time available to come and talk to us, let alone do some research on the Pemberton area. So thank you, Eric, and we really look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. My title, Squamish, Pemberton, and the Northwest Passage by Rail. I would like to speak about our connections, Squamish and Pemberton, in both directions. The Northwest Passage, I'm inspired by a book by a BC historian, Daphne Slay, on Walter Moberly. I had only heard a little bit about Walter Moberly prior to reading this book and then doing some more and finding him here and there and everywhere. He's a very important person for this corridor, and I will make that argument later a couple of times in the presentation. Her title is brilliant, The Northwest Passage by Rail. And he was the person who first identified the potential rail route through this corridor as far as 1859. But I'll come back to this theme of the Northwest Passage by Rail. Now in Squamish, we are celebrating 100 years for a few reasons. First of all, prior to 100 years ago, we were Newport. This reads Squamish at the bottom of that left-hand side of that panorama photo from, 1914, and it is in fact kind of like our birth certificate. It's the first time Squamish was used in a document like that. It is on this set of photographs. The photograph was produced for the PGE Railway, and it was sent to London, England to try to raise money. Unsuccessfully, however. We'll come back to that. But the company was very proud of the town site it had built by 1914, a completed town site from what was hayfield just a few short years earlier. Below we see climbing up on the same rock, tried to find the same place where the photographer was, and luckily there's not too much vegetation has sprung up there, and managed to find more or less the same viewpoint. And I'm going to bring a real photographer there one day. So, I am preoccupied with the theme of transportation and its importance for kind of the self-identity of Squamish. And if you like, our whole corridor. I think it's tremendously important. And transportation in both directions. And I'm using this fisheye shot to emphasize that theme. Squamish is a portal to the Pacific, but also a gateway to an interior landscape. In fact, it's Pemberton's portal to the Pacific, and it's the gateway to Pemberton. I think that it's important to understand how this gateway works in both directions and how these functions feed off of each other and how they really do depend on each other. Tourism needing the railway, needing the roads, and all kinds of partnerships. Now, my family background is we came out from northern Alberta in the early 60s, my father, and got a job at wood fiber. And so my family, myself, my brothers, going to school, putting our way through university, our background is in the resource industries. And mine continues to be to this day. My dad, when he came to Squamish, he realized he was in an idyllic location because, as he wrote back to his family, we have behind us the world's finest ski terrain. So another part of my identity and my idea of Squamish is this recreational landscape that's just behind us. I've never really come to see the resource industry and that landscape as being opposed to each other until people tried to convince me of that in recent years, and I'm preoccupied with explaining to them that let's look at some history and see how they work together. And in fact, one or another have been around both in partnerships for a very long time. Now, this is my friend Alice Gus, Soasius Spukwus. She is a very noteworthy ambassador of the Squamish Nation, and she's standing beside some rock art in northern Howe Sound near Furry Creek. Let's have a closer look. This rock art is quite interesting because it's positioned in a place where a shaman would have been working. A nice shelf on the side of the cliff face near just north of Furry Creek, where you can look to the south, or it's kind of a gateway to northern Howe Sound, this location, a place where you can work in privacy and do your shamanistic rituals. And this is what this is, because we find these types of symbols from California all the way up to Siberia. It's a language of characters and symbolic ideas. But there's something noteworthy here. This is very much a coastal figure. It's a human figure. And you can see it's going to be leading to the contemporary coastal art we know it's been produced in the past several centuries up and down the coast. Whereas this figure, which is a wolf, is an interior design. It's something, if you find rock art in the Pemberton Valley area, you might find designs more closer to that wolf, that solid-bodied figure. But what is interesting here is that both are side by side on the same rock face. Where Alice was, we saw here. There's the wolf, there's the human figure. And maybe that's the serpent slayer. And that's another figure we see here, a double-headed serpent. Very common up and down the coast and in our area. Now, the first European to visit northern Howe Sound was Captain Vancouver and his right-hand Lieutenant Peter Puget. They each were rowing boats with a crew of about 14 in each rowboat. And they rowed all the way up from Birch Bay in Puget Sound, where they had parked their sailing ships for repairs. And their instructions were to look for the Northwest Passage. And so Captain Vancouver has written some pretty good journals, and we can interpret his moods in these journals. And by the time he gets up to Squamish, he's not in a great mood, because he realizes this is pointless. There isn't going to be a Northwest Passage here. And now they want me to row all the way up to the back of Jarvis Inlet 2, which he later named. And we're not going to find it. I'm convinced of that, but I guess I have to plod on and follow my instructions. Other than that, we had poor weather, late June, mid-June, southerly storms. So his notation for Squamish was, or the head of Howe Sound, the dreary, comfortless region. It's my idea for a t-shirt for the wintertime. Now, because of that, notation, which was transferred to maps, and Vancouver's maps were used for a very long time, well past the gold rush, in fact. We didn't see any tourists for a very long time. We didn't see anybody, in fact, until 1858, when the Hudson's Bay Company man employed by the colonial government, Governor Douglas, this is Joseph William Mackay, who is a Métis ancestry, actually, although he had some education in Scotland, I believe. And he was instructed to explore the route from Port Pemberton, see where that red line is, down towards the head of Howe Sound. And a following year, we had Lieutenant Maine, who was reporting to Captain Richards. Captain Richards, who was surveying Howe Sound, Maine was going to do the overland route from the south to the north this time, using some advice given him by his predecessor Mackay. And so we have this corridor mapped for the first time. However, they both traveled with native guides, interior Salish, coast Salish, not necessarily Squamish or Lillooet, but people who knew the routes that they were going to travel. These guides, of course, for them, this is an ancient travel corridor. And it's one that's used for the Oolican fishery in the lower Squamish. Is centered around just above the tide line, in fact just behind the Squamish Adventure Center. And here were major camps during the Oolican fishery season. And the Grease Trail to Lillooet, or what we now know of as the town of Lillooet and the Fraser River, started here by canoe and up the valley, up the Cheakamus. And here we have Lillooet, and in the other direction is the Squamish River system has no sockeye. So there was trade, Oolican for sockeye. This is an ancient trade and travel corridor, as we saw in that rock garden Howe Sound. Now in 1871, when British Columbia joined Confederation, there was a promise of a railway. Well, where are we going to build it? What route are we going to take? What's the terminus going to be? This wasn't settled for a long time, but the provincial government wisely saw that it needed to reserve certain places where possible railway terminuses could be built, because otherwise they may be preempted with settlers and so on. And so the Squamish chiefs, they wanted some land security. And so by 1871, we had the lower Squamish Delta already identified as a reserve for potential future port or railway terminus. And in 1876, when the Indian reserves of the Squamish Valley were established, the chiefs agreed. They knew the strategic value of the Squamish Delta, and so they agreed to allow this port reserve to stay there. And that's everything south of Pemberton Avenue, if you know where that is, in downtown Squamish. Later it becomes Lot 486, and it includes this piece over here as well. So 1871, already we have a port reserve, a future railway terminus. And in 1873, this corridor is surveyed for the Canadian Pacific Railway. And Walter Moberly, one of my heroes, was one of those people involved in those surveys, although not in this course. He came out from Ontario, a real adventurer, a civil engineer by training, and he worked for the Royal Engineers. And he and Robert Burnaby, a friend of his, were working for the Royal Engineers in Burrard Inlet, and they decided, let's skip and go and check out some country. So they managed to find their way up to the north of Howe Sound, looking for gold or adventure, both. And they ended up staying several weeks. Now Walter and his friend Robert Burnaby, after whom Burnaby is named, they camped here at Cheakamus. Cheakamus was a very large village at that time. You may know this area today as the North Vancouver Outdoor School. It is also one of the early ranches of the Squamish Valley. But Robert and Walter were camped down there for a couple of weeks, and they got on so well they just about didn't escape without being married off to the chief's daughters. But at any rate, one of the things I like about some of these explorers is where they really did get along very well with the local Aboriginal people, and we can certainly say that for Walter Moberly. And he writes about it in a very entertaining way, and we can learn a lot from him. So he's camped out here, and they trekked as far as latitude 50. I don't know exactly where that is, but he decided, no, this isn't what we want. I'm looking for a transcontinental railway route. This is the wrong alignment, but I can see its potential. It's like a northwest passage by rail. That's the potential this route has. And so he saw already then, or claimed later, but I believe him, he's written about this in several places, about his visit up the Cheakamus and his idea, the potential of it for a wagon road at least, but possibly a railway. He was a great and early railway enthusiast. Now this is the route of the Pemberton Trail, just here, and it's right above where we saw. And the railway tracks below that were built from about 1912, 1913, the railway was put in through there. The first settler there was a fellow who was a Civil War veteran from the United States, a gold prospector who also explored this area and may have passed on his knowledge to the guy he sold the ranch to, J.C. Gill. He'll come up later. But I believe that Ike Hayden, the American fellow's name was, he's one of the first people who saw gold in the Bridge River Valley. So he traveled quite a bit up this way too. This is a very interesting area. So we have the Klondike Gold Rush. Lots of gold activity in the northern BC and further to the north. And already by 1890, we have ideas about building railways, grand ideas. And Walter is involved. He's gone away to work, do some work further east in the country, but he returns when this Klondike Gold Rush is on and all this other activity up in the north. He says, I have an idea. I know where you can build a railway. The Cheakamus. Squamish, Cheakamus, and north. He knew the rest of the country through his work with the CPR. You can see early ideas, fantastic ideas to build a railway. This is the Squamish River. So it would come up Lynn or up the Seymour and over that way and then down the Squamish into the Squamish Valley and then take the route we know today for the highway and the railway. So there was a series of proposals to build these. Walter Moberly is behind every single one of them as the visionary. He had no money, but he had knowledge of the landscape. He continued to explore up this way. And he had a great knack for finding people of influence and convincing them to invest. So, the Dawson up to the Yukon, 1905, but back here, 1893, there were quite a number of these. Now in this valley you have a railway pass. That is something on your map. Walter Moberly was involved in all of these charters, one of which did survey the Hurley route. Where that name comes from, I take it. But it wasn't probably the one that he advised on. As Nikki's mentioned earlier, it's the Gold Rush route, travel route that was selected, and the one he had in mind as well. Walter Moberly's archives in the Vancouver City Archives, among other places, are vast. He was a prolific writer. Wrote a lot about his own glory and his own achievements, many, many letters, all by hand, all directed to people of influence, and they're all in double copies so we can read ad nauseum about his exploits, all for the purpose of convincing people that he knew where to go with these railways and how to build them. His vision was for an electric railway from Burrard Inlet up over into the Squamish and further north up to Pemberton Meadows. Now here is, we're looking at Howe Sound and there's Furry Creek. Already there was a lot of mineral exploration here in the 1890s and into the up in Seymour Creek Way, and then later of course when the Britannia mines started becoming established after the turn of the century. He wanted to bring the rail down Furry Creek to Howe Sound here, and a grand tunneling scheme to go through the pass, or to go through the summit. Now, among the people of influence he tried to convince of these schemes was a great timber magnate, C.T. Dunbar, an American, or originally an American, who's also associated with the Dunbar subdivision in the west side of Vancouver. Dunbar owned all the timber in the Mamquam. How's he going to get it out? Well, Walter had an idea. I'll show you where you can build a railway. He went on for a good 15 years, courting people of influence, explaining his ideas. And here we see where we are in our part of the country, Pemberton. Up here, you can see Walter's proposal for a Seymour Creek-Lillooet Electric Railway 1908. Prepared by Walter Moberly, civil engineer. And this is deposited in the City Archives in Vancouver. And here's the northerly portion, roughly following our traditional his idea with other investors. Another great timber magnate, John Hendry, who owned several sawmills in the Lower Mainland. And Charles Hayes, who was the Grand Trunk Pacific president, and constantly writing letters to these people. And Premier McBride, who was a great railway promoter, of course. This is a very expansive time. It's a railway up to just about 1912, I suppose. It sort of comes to an end. But the 1890s through up to them is a great railway period for our part of North America. So in 1909, we see this announcement from a rival group that Moberly is not a part of. One thing I find charming about Walter is that he was right, he had a vision, he was never successful, didn't become famous, never became wealthy, but I'm convinced in the end he is going to receive his due in the history books. At any rate, a rival group, Vancouver investors, were at it as well, and we're leading now to the Newport project. And these fellows found a way that you could bring the line through the Cheakamus Canyon, maintaining a grade that was appropriate and usable. And so they didn't tell anybody though, and in the meantime they bought up all the land they could in the Delta of Squamish. And so one of these promoters in this rival group, and there was a great deal of competition between different factions and people with different railway charters, was J.C. Gill. And J.C. Gill, as I mentioned, bought this ranch. He thought to retire, and he was probably belonging to the right political party at the time, because that's how you got jobs like being a game warden, which he was for this whole region. And so Mr. Gill owned this ranch, and in the meantime he's building a mansion in North Vancouver on the boulevard. It still exists as a heritage building. It's a nice place that you can visit. And so I believe he had second ideas about retirement and saw again, listening to other people, listening perhaps to Walter Moberly's reading his material in the papers and so on. And he's one of the key people behind what became the Howe Sound and Pemberton Valley Northern Railway project. Later Howe Sound and Northern, and the Newport venture. What is very important to know about this group of J.C. Gill and J.C. Keith, this gentleman here, and the same fellow here, Keith, the financier or the financial whiz within the group, and several others, is that they were local investors. Vancouver old boys, if you like. Oppenheimer, these names that we know through the streets and old parts of Vancouver, they were local Vancouver people who had been around since the gold rush. The PGE, that's a different set of characters altogether. So that's something very distinctive about the Newport project, the Howe Sound and Northern project, is these were local Vancouver investors. In the end, they lost out. The government favored the other people who invested in the hops industry in the Squamish Valley in the 1890s. And all knew each other very well. William Shannon, George McGee, and very successful people in an expansive period for British Columbia. So their project is Newport. And by 1909, it's announced in a grand way as a big real estate scheme, not only in Squamish Valley, but here, if I'm not mistaken, Agerton. An earlier venture, a real estate venture in this valley, is connected with the same people who bought up land here. Gradually, their ambitions increased, and they saw, with the competition around them, they better get in line and get all the charters lined up to declare themselves ready to head to Fort George when they're ready to link up with the Transcontinental Railway being built up there. Now, when the PGE takes over in 1912, the provincial government selected that group for certain privileges in the terms of bonds, government-backed bonds, and they bought out an unfriendly takeover of the Newport group. But all the real estate and all of the claims about the scheme continued, and this is during the PGE era, probably 1912, I see at the top there of this advertisement, and they're selling real estate in what is now Dentville in Squamish. Newport will be the funnel, because of course there's only three ways through the coast on the Pacific coast of Canada. There's the Skeena River, the Fraser River, and the Cheakamus and Squamish route. There is really no other practical way to get to the Pacific, and this is what they're promoting in their advertisements. This is going to be valuable, folks, this strategic route. Now I'd like to digress here just a bit to point out that already before all of this railway scheming was going on, we had a tourism industry building. And that tourism extended as far as you could reach, practically. So for some of the more adventurous, they would go venture up any amount of trails for fishing. Checklands was already well known as a fishing river in the 1890s. Between 1903 and 1907, we had 4 tourist hotels or lodges built in Squamish. And so this industry kept pace with any kind of access developed. Tourism came with it. This is the Squamish Hotel, built by Galbraith in 1902-1903. The Checkmas House, also built by Galbraith, 1907. It was taken out by floods. This was lost in the 70s due to other development. This is the Bracken Arms Hotel. We lost that one to fire in, I believe, 1908 or something like that. So, and this is the Judd Cottonwood Ranch, which hosted mountaineers as far back as 1905. So it's something to keep in mind. Tourism isn't new. It has always been here, and it has kept pace with the transportation access available. And the early railway companies, the House Sound and Northern Group and the PGE Group, from the very beginning saw the potential of tourism. And working with the steamship companies, at that time, the Terminal Steam Navigation Company, the Cates, Jack Cates' company. 1920, taken over by the Union Steamships Company, but working in partnership with the railway. The mountaineers were active in the Garibaldi area and promoting the establishment of Garibaldi Park as early as 1910. And these fellows here, catching a ride. The railway's just being poked up through the Checkmas Canyon, and they're already catching a free ride up into the mountains. 1912, the Rebel Creek Trail is discovered, or mapped out by Billy Gray. And so we have mountaineering and naturalists also in these early expeditions, making their way up by rail already in 1913. Illustration, because it's a passenger car, and this reference to empire, so we have to stretch our concept of empire as not only an empire of resources for export, but an empire of scenery as well. So these are 2 themes that are with this transportation corridor and how we use it. Now this is the portal to the Pacific for Pemberton, completed in 1914. There was another barge dock that came out this way. This is the passenger steamship section, and this is the freight shed. And this is the new dock built completed in 1914, and it replaced, as a steamship dock, this one, built in 1902. Now, eventually, this one was found to be built too close to the river, and it was very difficult to maintain. And so it was phased out by the end of the 1920s. And the pilings on the southwest corner of the downtown Squamish Peninsula are that original PGE terminal dock. And we can see the pilings here. So those are exactly 100 years old, those pilings. We don't have a lot of buildings around Squamish, but we do have old pilings. And I think we should be mindful of those. Now what happened was the river kept doing damage to that dock. So they rebuilt it where this one was, over on the easterly side. And so the old government wharf is just on the other side here. This is the steamship dock would come up. You'd get out of there and jump on the train. And the freight took place over here, leading to the barge apron. And this was the setup from late 1920s to the late 1950s, when the highway was completed. Now that used to be a trestle, and that filling in, that rock fill, was introduced sometime after the Second World War, later 1940s. Long trestles, and here's that Galbraith Squamish Hotel, a landmark building of Squamish for many. These are 2 important people, especially in considering the Pacific Great Eastern Railway Company and that whole project. Darcy Tate was a lawyer by training and worked as an advisor and chief legal counsel, if you like, to Charles M. Hayes, who was originally from the United States and one of Canada's great railway barons, and a very successful railway entrepreneur, proved himself in the railway business over time and became president of the Grand Trunk Pacific. And the Grand Trunk realized that the route out to Prince Rupert was insufficient. They had to reach down to the Port of Vancouver. And the scheme then was to take over, push these other people aside who were trying to do the same thing, and we are going to run a Grand Trunk Pacific controlled railway project connecting Fort George, Prince George, to Howe Sound or Burrard Inlet if we can do it. So that was Hayes' idea, and it was executed mainly by Darcy Tate. Another person important to the picture is John W. Stewart, who ended up being president of the railway. He was a railway building contractor. And so Tate and Stewart and another few people formed a company, the Pacific Great Eastern Railway Company. And the most important thing at this time was something that Hayes decided. And that is, we're not going to give you control over the freight. We're going to continue to have first right of refusal on all freight on this line. And that proved to be a very significant business decision because it meant that the people that are going to build the railway have to make their money in other ways. And so they did that during the construction. The PGE construction was a disaster, where cost overruns, corruption, and so on, all traced back to this decision by Hayes to control the revenue from freight and what was going to happen with the freight in the interest of the Grand Trunk Pacific. Hayes went down in the Titanic. And I have a dear old friend of mine, Bill Manson in Squamish, grew up in Prince Rupert, and he always, when the subject of Hayes and all this would come up, he says, you know, if Hayes hadn't gone down in the Titanic, Prince Rupert might have become something. A lottery. And maybe that's true for Squamish too. But I think that this disaster, of course, in 2012, in the end, there was not enough freight business that foreseeable at that time to justify either of these railways on the scale that they were envisioned. Squamish, Prince Rupert, PGE, the Grand Trunk Pacific, there just wasn't going to be that volume of freight. It was a speculative, expansive period, and we've seen those kinds of booms and speculative booms had already really started as far as the financial markets were concerned. Already by 1912, there was so much unrest in Europe, it was very difficult to obtain financing for railway projects in North America on the London markets. And that's the problem they ran into, and that's why they went all out to produce these beautiful photographs to do their best to raise that money, to show what they had accomplished with this railway so far, reaching Pemberton, reaching Lillooet, this port facility in Squamish. But in the end, they were unsuccessful. They weren't going to raise the extra money they needed to build to Fort George. They made it to Quesnel, as we know, 1922 to Quesnel. So anyway, that's where these photos were produced for, was to convince the financiers in London to continue this railway project. Now, Major Stewart, the president of the PGE, already by this time is busy during the war effort cause, and a lot of the equipment and men working on this line were diverted to Europe and the railway corps that he formed over there, which is a very interesting story. Major Stewart was also successful in the timber business on both sides of the line. But tourism events and so on have their traffic inconveniences as well. So what's in those cars, by the way, is pellets, wood pellets, and there's probably a few trainloads a week. Newport will be the funnel. Well, what I'm doing here is pointing to the future. What can we predict based on the past and based on our geography? We're not going to be creating new valleys out to the Pacific. There's too much fossil fuels involved in a project like that. It won't happen. We're going to have to manage these gateways as best we can. And something to recognize about this gateway through this corridor is that it is the closest route to the coast by road for a vast area of Western Canada. Closer than Vancouver, closer than Prince Rupert. The problem is the standard of the road, the Duffy Lake and so on up to Highway 97. But by distance, it is closer. And any trucker will tell you that their use of that road would change according to its upgrade. And so that's an important consideration for the long term. Now, CN Rail, when they first were involved in discussions for the purchase of BCR, had proposed to close down this section of the railway and route everything over to their main line here. I think that would be a foolish idea, but as people who are involved in working with these large railway companies, they often observe is that they tend to have a short memory of things like natural hazards and landslides and avalanches. They always catch us by surprise. Sometimes their effects are catastrophic. In 2004, there was an avalanche in central southern BC which backed up containers back to Florida. It was a catastrophe. Billions probably in losses, business losses. And a lot of our transportation infrastructure investments we've been making, perimeter road and gateway this and gateway that, they stem from that problem that was noted then, neglect of our transportation corridors. And I think that we shouldn't be surprised that about these things. We could do a better job of maintaining dialogue on what we need to do to maintain them, and none of them are expendable. This rail corridor through Squamish and Pemberton, I don't think is expendable. It may not be immortal. Maybe we'll forget and we'll goof up and we'll close it down, but it probably will be a mistake. Because as we see the landslide events, just example looking here, we can predict that they're going to be a greater in frequency. That's the prediction. With changing weather patterns and so on, different kinds of pressures, that it's not a good idea to close them because the other valley routes through the southern interior, through the Rockies, are just as bad. So that we are going to be with this railway corridor and we should make the best of it. We perhaps have been affected in our dialogue about managing this rail corridor by the mountain pine beetle problem, because it has been a huge distraction for communities in the Cariboo that really depend on this corridor, have for so long, and now they're distracted by this enormous problem and challenge for them. I think that we all have to remind ourselves that we are caretakers of a resource, this corridor, that is going to be important for people in the interior for their tourism development, but also for their future exports, new manufacturing that they will want to develop to maintain their communities in the central interior. So we should consider ourselves as caretakers of this corridor as well. Now, the forest is growing like the dickens in Squamish. We've lost, in the Squamish Forest District, now the Sea to Sky District, we've lost a lot of area to other uses in parks and different standards and forest practices that mean we don't go through riparian zones and so on. So a lot of land area is no longer within the working forest, but nonetheless our working forest harvest potential is actually increasing in the long run. We have a harvest potential in our working forest of 650,000 cubic meters today. It is projected to increase to maybe 800,000 cubic meters in 20, 30 years from now. So it's something to keep in mind. The forest industry is in fact growing and has no reason, anyway, not to grow in terms of its business activity. We have been going back into the history archives to look at some old reports to try to remind our District of Squamish planners and regional district planners of these things. And it's good that we hold on to these old documents because sometimes things don't change and we need to remind people again. And that is what the log flows are like. Where do they come from? We got logs coming up the Lillooet and coming through here and down to Squamish and by rail and so on. And this picture is something that the person who's not involved with the industry may not appreciate, and may not appreciate the need for the infrastructure that's necessary to handle this, all of these patterns. It's mostly been a short sea, coastwise shipping port. From early PGE days, barge traffic, other kind of coasters, even hauling ore and so on. The deep sea vessels are what's in front of you and are obvious, but that's not actually most of the activity. And what has been happening is we've been forgetting that and overlooking the planning needs for the short sea or coastwise shipping, and it affects Pemberton, it affects Lillooet, it affects 100 Mile, and so on. All of these people have need for this corridor and the terminus of Squamish for shipping products, so we should keep this in mind. And meanwhile, down south of the border, they are so desperate to reduce the traffic, truck and rail, over their border crossings. They're looking for new ideas, going back to old ideas of shipping by water and barge, and asking British Columbia and authorities here to let's go back to our old tricks and of shipping by water, and so also maybe designing new types of vessels that can go and drop by at Campbell River, Nanaimo, Squamish, and pick up containers, just little batches of them. So we need to consider this, and so I and other people who have a kind of history buffs, if you like, we're just trying to point this out, that before we have these planning processes that completely eliminate in Squamish the coastwise shipping capability, replacing it with condominiums, don't go too fast now. Let's have a look and see what we've been doing in the past and how relevant it is for the future. Another idea relating to both tourism and freight traffic, and closer to here, I believe this is near the Big Slide area, and I know that some of you are involved in, of course, this museum included in the tourism business and hoping for better, improved traffic in future. That Silko route, Vancouver, Lillooet, and back down the Fraser Canyon, it sure could be better utilized and better promoted. And some investment could go in some of the roads, as our Squamish Chamber of Commerce are being given a tour about this issue before. I think that with the historical perspective, it gives us a bit of an advantage to picture this and its significance. So, I'm going to end with this slide, and it is a recommendation based on, if you like, historical observations, is that the best route for the future is collaboration between Squamish, Pemberton, and beyond, to remind ourselves of our past uses of this corridor, rail, road, and things, ideas that were never realized but could be. And we don't have the PGE or even the BCR anymore. Maybe that's an advantage, and in other ways not, but there are new actors, and I think it's always good to keep a regional perspective and friendly conversations and communications going so we can identify opportunities and steer our best efforts towards the best ideas. Thank you very much.